Good morning. My name is Councillor Gary Crawford, and I am the Chair of the Budget Committee. The Clerk has confirmed that we have quorum, so I'd like to now call meeting 20 of the Budget Committee to order, and I would like to welcome everybody who is online to our real first entire budget process that will be virtual. Today's meeting is being held by video conference. City staff are also connecting to the meeting by video conference. As City Hall remains closed, the public will continue to participate electronically and can watch the meeting streaming live on YouTube at youtube.com/Toronto City Council Live. And of course, I'd like to ask for everyone's patience if we experience any delays or technical problems during the meeting. Members, this is a paperless meeting. The City Clerk will provide today's presentation materials on toronto.ca/council and for members on the Clerk's meeting portal. Clerk's IT staff are also available to you remotely if you need any help on your devices. And I'd like to remind staff to keep the mics muted and videos turned off unless they need to answer questions or speak to the committee. It'll make it a lot easier for me as the chair and for those watching YouTube to observe members as they participate in the meeting and vote on items. And members, I'd also like to ask that you keep your mic muted during the presentation, and please keep your video turned on. If there are any visiting members of council attending the meeting today, I encourage you to keep your video on so that we know that you're present, and specifically when we get into questions of staff. And it'll also help the clerk's office to record attendance for the meeting. Although we are in different locations and meeting remotely, the committee would like to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples. We'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. First, I'd like to see if there are any declarations of interest under Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. If you have an interest, please raise your hand and unmute your mic. Seeing none, thank you. This is a special meeting of the Budget Committee. It is the launch of the 2021 capital and operating budgets. We have only one item at today's meeting, and it is a presentation from the City Manager and the Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer. Following the presentation, I will open up the floor to questions and create a list of names for questions of staff on the presentation. The agenda for the 2021 budget review meeting on January 20th and 21st and 22nd will be published this afternoon after the meeting adjourns. The agenda for the 2021 budget review meeting will include the staff-recommended tax-supported budgets and the schedule for presentations from city divisions and agencies, which we're going to hear next Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. The agenda will also include the detailed budget notes for the tax-supported and the programs and agencies in the City of Toronto. And I'd like to thank staff for their incredible hard work that they've been doing with these budget notes. The Budget Committee will hear public speakers on the 2021 capital and operating budgets on Monday, January 25th and Tuesday, January 26th. This year, because we are meeting virtually, we'll be able to meet as a full committee over the 2 days to hear the public, different than in years past where we had two subcommittees going across the city. Members of the public who wish to speak at the Budget Committee meetings can register by emailing buc@toronto.ca and choosing a time slot either on January 25th or 26th to speak. And the time slots will be from 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., 1:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m., and 6 to 9 p.m. After we hear from the public, the Budget Committee will again meet on January 28th and on February 4th to make our final recommendations to Executive Committee and, of course, to full Council for consideration on February 18th. Committee members, this is a tough budget year. I don't have to stress with what has happened over the last year that this will be probably our toughest budget season we have seen, or many of us have seen in recent memory. Though this is the start of the budget process for 2021, an incredible amount of work has gone in by city staff, not only for this budget, but as you are well aware, over the last 10 months or so in trying to manage the challenges that we've been having for 2020. And again, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank the staff for the incredible amount of work, not only the city manager and the CFO, but all city agencies and divisions. They've done an incredible amount of work, as you will see very quickly. As you will see shortly, we have already identified many opportunities for savings and efficiencies while at the same time protecting the city's services that we hold very dear to us and are desperately needed in the time of COVID. A lot of work has been done to make sure that we are holding the line on tax increases while at the same time preserving those important services that residents rely on, and including some enhancements. We traditionally look at how can we improve and enhance the services that we provide residents. In this budget, you will see that too. Along, of course, with our strengthened partnership with the province and the federal government, I think you'll see in this budget is incredibly important. So on that, I would like to pass this over to the city manager and staff to give the presentation of the 2021 operating and capital budgets. Mr. Murray, over to you.
So first of all, I want to thank the budget chief for all that he has done. And of course, I want to thank the committee that's here today for working with us as you've done in the past and will continue to do so. I mean, I think as pointed out, this is a very challenging budget, goes without saying. I have to echo the public service, that of course includes the agencies, boards, and corporations that we work with as well. Today, the presentation is going to be overseen by, Steve.
Chris, I'm just wondering, we are having some technical difficulties with your stream. I don't know if you can hear us. If you can maybe just, yeah, we're having a few technical difficulties already, unfortunately, with your stream. So I think if you can just give us a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd try again. I would suggest maybe starting from the beginning because I think you cut out very quickly after your comments began.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe can you hear me now? Thanks very much. Excellent. Can we put the slide presentation up now and I'll start over? I'll try not to go too fast because there's some important thank yous I have to provide. So again, let's start from the beginning. And first I want to thank the budget chief and committee for taking the time today to listen to our presentation. Also, I have to thank the presenters. You're going to hear Steve Conforti and Heather Taylor, who will be assisting me for the next 45 minutes or so. This is a COVID responsive budget. I don't need to tell any of you just how incredibly challenging 2020 has been, and certainly 2021. It is our job, as you well know, to think through all the challenges and all the services we provide and present to you a balanced budget. I can say to you that we are clearly going to be recommending a way forward with this year's budget. It's not to suggest that there isn't an alternative strategy if it needs to be implemented. But so in effect, there are two paths that we can follow to achieve a balanced budget, which all of you know as municipalities in this province, and we are required to approve such a thing. So if I can, let's go to the next slide. You've seen this slide now. This is our third budget, or the third one that I've provided you as city manager. This diagram shows the fundamental relationship that exists within this community, and that relationship is between Torontonians and obviously yourselves as decision makers and ourselves as the public service. And the essence of really what we try to do each and every day when we deliver services is to earn people's trust and confidence. And so our citizens expect, and our visitors and our businesses, they have aspirations, they have fundamental needs, and you are elected to provide leadership to them to make sure those things happen. And of course, you give us direction and we give you advice or recommendations as to how we can achieve that direction. And of course, we receive taxes and fees and we provide valued services in return. So in the most simplest form, this is what the relationship is. But, all of us know that the last 12 months have been extraordinary. And certainly the next 12 months and beyond are going to be equally challenging. And I'll just say from my own perspective that the term of trust and confidence, how that applies to the political leadership that we have seen from you, has been extraordinary. We know we are well led by a mayor who has done a phenomenal job, I think, at both levels of government, being able to articulate our needs and our concerns, and we've been rewarded for that, and I'll get into that in a minute. We also have had, a lot of success building relationships with people, and that is deemed to be quite successful. So, but also I have to give credit to a number of others, all of council, of course, but certainly Councillor Cressy in his role as the head of the Board of Health, and then certainly the task force that were employed during COVID. So, Councillor Bilo, or Deputy Mayor Bilo, Councillor McKelvey, Carol, Bradford, and yourself, Budget Chief Crawford, you've led this organization well in your capacity as political representatives. And then, of course, as staff, I can't say enough about our front line. I can't say enough about our management. This is, no one could have predicted this, but I think at the end of the day, we have, as a public service, I think served you as well as you would hope, and then maybe even more so. And then, of course, credit to our citizens. We know they have been incredibly responsive, and we are in the midst of a very difficult time right now. But there are endless examples of people stepping up and helping others and working with us and being effective. And so it's that kind of spirit of cooperation, collaboration that I think, at the end of the day, underscores what public service is really all about, and that is to earn people's trust and confidence. And so I'm quite proud of where we've been and where we are, and certainly where we're going. Next slide. So from a COVID impact perspective, January 25th of last year was the first recorded case of COVID in Toronto. So we are coming up to our 1-year anniversary. And, obviously a lot has happened since then. Today, we have confirmed cases since that first one of 73,675. And tragically, 2,126 of our citizens have passed. In hospital today, we have 466, with 94 in the ICU. And you'll recall very clearly that when we set out to address the COVID matter, that our goal was very quite simple. It was threefold. First and foremost, save lives. Secondly, to not overwhelm the healthcare system. And we know the measures that were announced yesterday are addressing that challenge that we have as we see ICU units start to be tapped out. And so it is critically important that we respect the direction that we've been given. And then, of course, the third and equally important is to save livelihoods. And tremendous work has been done by this organization with the support of the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario. And so that exists today, and you're going to hear through the course of this presentation that it's not just about 2021, the challenges that we'll face. We believe that there will be certainly ongoing challenges as we move forward. I can't say enough about partnerships and collaboration. We have been taking a whole of government, whole of community approach. If it wasn't for the relationships that have been built over the months and years, I don't know where we would be, but it is through those partnerships and collaborations, that kind of level-headedness that people take to the table whenever, or to the WebEx, I guess, whenever we're talking, that has yielded literally billions of dollars of support that we've received. And so this is going to continue to be important to us, not just from a financial standpoint, but by this notion that, as things start to improve and the vaccine starts to have its effect, that we are going to continue to build on those partnerships and collaborations to build a more prosperous Toronto. An operating budget, you're going to hear clearly from Heather Taylor, our CFO and Treasurer, where we're at. This budget is approaching now almost $14 billion. And of course, that includes our rate budget, which was approved back in December. And from a capital standpoint, Steve is going to talk about the 10-year program, which is worth in the order of about $45 billion. Next slide. So our response last year was an investment of $1.7 billion And of course, that came from all levels of government. So the government of Canada, province of Ontario, and ourselves. And we'll talk in a minute about what we did to help ourselves along with the other levels of government. And as I say, it's a whole of government approach. And of course, we had to have immediately measures taken by our good doctor, Dr. Davila, in terms of the measures to help to curb the growth and the challenge that the COVID virus was creating in our community, And of course, an economic response. I mean, as businesses were closing, we needed to provide some leadership and some direction in terms of what it is that we could do to support businesses that still needed to open its doors figuratively and still, maintain the threads that are critical to our economy. So there was a lot of work that was done there, and I'm not going to list everything because it would be too numerous. And of course, from a transportation and a mobility standpoint, I think we've seen a rapid growth in bike lanes and certainly infrastructure that we were wanting to get involved with more so, but certainly have seen tremendous growth in those areas. And of course, with respect to maintaining certainly a reasonable level of transit support for this community. Community response, of course, I mean, we've been working effectively with a number of groups to make sure that people are looked after. And there's a whole list of works that I know Julie and her team have done. Again, too numerous to list here. Housing and shelters, the minute that we knew we had to address, so isolation forms that we had to improve our shelter capacity. But as well to continue down the road of investing in housing. And then, of course, when everything went digital, we had to pivot and make sure that we were going to have those services to do that. So again, tremendous amount of work that underpins that investment of $1.7 billion last year. Next slide, please. Really important. You'll recall when this was all unfolding last year, I think in the early days, when we were looking at what were the likely impacts on user fees, be it revenues or anything of that nature, and then to get a sense of what we think the projected cost might be. I think originally we were saying to you that we saw somewhere between about $1.5 billion to $2.2 billion was going to be the range of consequence that we were going to have to somehow address in 2020. And so we have in the breakdown here, and I think it's an important slide, first and foremost, our philosophy very much is that before we can ask anyone else for help, we need to help ourselves. And so we did come forward in last year with the $534 million worth of mitigation strategies to try and tackle what was in 2020 a $1.7 billion challenge. And so that was the first order of business that we undertook and was supported by yourselves. And of course, the Safe Restart Phases 2 and the original agreement, again, this is where we have to give credit to the Government of Canada and certainly the Province of Ontario for helping us through that program of $505 million and $669 million. So in total, we were able to address the $1.7 billion challenge. Now in 2021, when we look at the effect on revenues and expenses and everything that is part and parcel of the COVID reality that we're dealing with, again, it's important for the City of Toronto to come forward with what is it going to do in terms of trying to address or mitigate this financial challenge. And so this budget speaks to a $573 million effort that's been made by the city. And certainly I go to the bottom, and the funding that was announced and agreed to last year, we are able to take advantage of $740 million. So we have a net figure of $856 million, which we are going to continue to expect and ask the federal and provincial government for that money so that we can, at the end of the day, be able to demonstrate that all the service that we provide and the extraordinary challenges that we're facing with COVID, that we're able to address the financial component of it through this means. The alternative to this is to look very directly at our reserves and look very directly at our capital program and take that kind of money from those areas and it doesn't rule out the possibility of higher taxation, I think, as the mayor talked about on Tuesday, and other measures that might be contemplated if we are unable to get the federal and provincial government to support us. But very clearly in this budget, our strategy to balance the budget is to ask for, as we have received from the government of Canada and Province of Ontario, further financial assistance in the form of $856 million. Next slide. We all have to be reminded, despite the the challenging times and the financial outlooks and everything, is never lose sight of Toronto and what it was and what it is and what certainly it will be. Clearly, fastest growing city in North America, and despite COVID, we have still seen tremendous growth in construction, and we are seeing a whole range of activity that continues. From an economic driver of Canada and Ontario, I think all of you know Census Metropolitan Toronto, which is in part really the GTA, from a GDP standpoint, is equivalent to a combined GDP of Quebec and Alberta. So it is so significant, the economic importance of this city and the support of the surrounding region. It represents about 25% of the country's GDP. And through all of this, of course, we get credit rating assessments every year. And so we have maintained, despite the challenges, a very strong credit rating, AA stable. And that's in part because of the sound fiscal management of this organization, which is a shared responsibility between the administration and yourselves. And of course, we continue to make investments in transit and housing. I mean, we had that challenge before COVID, and it's become even more pronounced as a result. So we are seeing massive investments occur in transit, as I think all of you know, are long overdue. And of course, to address the housing needs of our community before, which were significant and have grown considerably. And this isn't to say that we haven't looked at and addressed and continue to address, investments in equity-related services, climate action, and the health and well-being of this community. So we are in good shape. Before. We are experiencing a challenge right now, which will not just end abruptly. It will continue to place challenges for us. But, if you're going to bet on a city in this country, and I would argue in this world, I would be betting on Toronto. Next slide. I think it's really important, and we're seeing a lot of certainly newscasts. And I must, provide a shout out to the media in this city that have done a phenomenal job of getting the message across that we've been trying to, certainly as it relates to COVID and just, the challenges that we're facing. And so, we know we had equity challenges before. We have systemic issues that not only are they surfaced, but they need to be addressed. And so we know as a result of COVID that, women have been disproportionately impacted. We know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, our population that was challenged before has even more so been challenged. And don't lose sight of the generational challenges as well. So any of us that have, children, young adults, if you will, that are looking to enter the workforce, I mean, many of them have been very challenged by the impact on the economy. And so we need to keep an eye on what it is that we are going to be able to do as a city to support, the equity challenge that we're facing. And I use the word climate action, and I know Councillor Layton is very committed to, and along with many and all of members of council. But it's not about so much climate change as what measures are we doing. That is going to be, I think, just as important as the equity measures in order to build this prosperous Toronto. And then, of course, the health and well-being. We all know people who are experiencing mental health issues, physical health issues, and sometimes, unfortunately, people experiencing, addiction issues. And so I think we really need to think about prosperity in these lights, as opposed to the rich get richer and everybody else struggles in varying degrees. I think if we were to focus our energies in this manner, Toronto will be that community when it's all said and done that people will look to, as they have in the past, as one of the great leaders municipally in this country and beyond. And so, of course, we did lay out a strategy through the TOR office, the COVID-19 Impacts and Opportunities Report, which was presented to you in October and approved laying out 83 actions. And certainly that's been augmented with the good work that's been done by Deputy Mayor Thompson about further measures that we need to take in order to support our business and cultural community. And not just in a medium and long-term standpoint, but efforts have to be made like right now as we work through the lockdown. But how is it that we're going to support our businesses to put people back to work and so that they can be successful? So at the end of the day, prosperity as defined as we have here, I think is going to be really important to our success. Next slide. And of course, equity, as we just talked about, as I explained, the challenges have only been mounting. And so you're going to see a number of services, and we call them equity-based services or equity-seeking services that we are going to continue to invest in. I mean, as we've had to ramp up certain service aspects of our program, I mean, that people have come to rely on, especially now, we're not taking those service levels down. We need to maintain them to continue to help people. In terms of all other services, I mean, they've been adjusted to reflect the direction that we get from Dr. DeVilla and the province in terms of what has to be done to keep people safe. So we are going to continue to do our level best to deliver the services to the service level that we can, recognizing the pressures that we do have from the public health measures. So, it's really important that our budget embed the equity considerations because, I mean, at the end of the day, we don't want to just be talking about this. We want to actually demonstrate action. And important for you to know that there's an external review panel. There's 9 members on it that represent various organizations within this community, as well as some support from our own staff that looks at the investments that are being proposed, certainly in terms of enhancements that are being proposed, and evaluates them from an equity standpoint. I would say, we are one of the first in the country. I wouldn't suggest that this is as mature as all of us will want it, but it is certainly making some significant progress for our organization. Next slide. So in closing, I mean, this is a responsive COVID budget. It addresses the impacts and the measures that we need to recover. Certainly, we need to preserve existing services consistent with health guidelines, as I mentioned, and of course, make the investments in equity-based services. Transit and transportation, all of these services are going to continue to be important to support the lives of this community. And of course, continued capital investments in mobility, housing, modernization, and the environment. And this is what you're going to see in the following slides. And then finally, I can't underscore enough the importance of the partnership with the Government of Canada, the Province of Ontario, and the leadership that we've had from you and your colleagues in terms of those relationships. They were important before. They're going to continue to be very important to all of us. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Heather.
Thanks, Chris. Just before we jump into the details of the 2021 budget, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge all the hard work that countless staff across the organization and our agencies who have helped prepare today's budget have put forward, but also who have been working on tracking COVID impacts weekly throughout 2020. To share with you the magnitude of the effort, the finance team has compiled and analyzed over 20,000 points of data related to COVID over the last 9.5 months. This information has been vital in informing and guiding our conversations and our negotiations and our decisions with regards to the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario. In addition to managing COVID demands, we are focused and continue to be committed to a longer-term outlook of financial sustainability. So as you can see here on the slide, financial sustainability is ensuring that we have predictable and reliable revenue streams to deliver city services and investments in the future. Next slide, please. So as Chris has mentioned, the COVID pandemic is truly unprecedented. The pandemic has been a catalyst in highlighting inequities amongst Torontonians, but we have delivered the crucial services our residents rely on, and we have expanded the services people need most during this pandemic. We've also introduced modernized options for residents and businesses, and we've developed innovative solutions to deliver services and to deliver services quickly. We have enabled more staff to work remotely, and we've developed process redesigns through investments in technology. The city will continue to build on the 2020 collaborative success with both the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario to secure a sustainable financial future. And we will advocate for the necessary revenue measures and clarify roles and accountability for service delivery. Next slide. Last year, the 2020 budget reflected the first year of a multi-year budget modernization project. Last year, budget information was informed by previous year's actual spending trends. We recast the 10-year capital plan to better reflect achievability and affordability. And we introduced a more efficient and simple budget process to make it more inclusive and transparent. Our plan is to deliver a service-based outcomes budget, which provides a multi-year outlook. And this year, year 2 of that plan, there is a focus on outcomes. We will demonstrate the value of services and identify performance measures. If you can go to slide 14, please. So the 2021 budget. At a glance, the city's overall combined operating budgets total $13.95 billion. The city's 10-year combined capital plan is $44.7 billion. If we can go to slide 16, please. So as we do every year, we establish a set of guiding principles to prepare a staff recommended budget. The first principle this year is managing the COVID demands for city services and the impacts COVID is having on our city. Each year, a budget is created based on a set of informed assumptions. The 2021 budget incorporates existing city service and service levels consistent with public health guidelines. Services which have been significantly impacted by COVID, such as the TTC, libraries, recreation, and the zoo, have been budgeted based on health guidelines and pandemic assumptions. And just as an added note, as in any given year, we will report on actual expenditures through quarterly variance reports. In 2021, we will continue to update these assumptions and information as service resumption occurs. We have prepared a budget that promotes tax affordability, given the economic impacts of COVID and the uncertainties the pandemic presents. And finally, COVID-19 has highlighted social and health inequities amongst Torontonians. We have expressed success in working with the governments of Canada, Ontario, and community partners to address these inequities. This experience is translated back into the investments that we need in areas that will help build back a stronger Toronto. The staff recommended tax supported budget is $12.09 billion. The city's rate budgets of $1.86 billion were approved by council in December, so resulting in the city's total combined operating budgets of $13.95 billion. So an overview. The 2021 balanced operating budget does assume continued funding support of $1.6 billion from the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario to address COVID-19 impacts. In 2020, the city successfully received $1.2 billion in Safe Restart funding to fully offset 2020 COVID impacts. It's important to note that $740 million of this $1.6 billion has already been confirmed. $573 million reflects a combination of $480 million of savings and offsets and $93 million in new revenue. I'd like to highlight that city leadership has worked really hard to find $480 million in offsets, efficiencies, and savings. For example, a salary freeze for non-union staff, the VSP impacts, and aligning actual spending trends to projections. The 2021 operating budget is consistent with public health guidelines and therefore the level of services in 2021 continues to reflect the realities of the pandemic, especially in the TTC, parks, zoo, and in the libraries. In keeping with the feedback we received from residents as part of the tour report, we are including an affordable tax increase of 0.7%, reflecting the rate of inflation. There is $56 million in new investments, which includes expansions to current programs, continuation of enhancements made in previous years, investments to address inequities highlighted by the pandemic, and modernization initiatives. Some examples of equity initiatives include Housing Now, Transit Fare Pass program expansion, and community-based safety initiatives. This slide captures 8 years of historical opening budget pressures triggered by inflation and growth in demand of our services. Last year, our 2020 budget was approved, and within 1 month, we were faced with the unexpected and unpredictable COVID impacts of $1.7 billion. We successfully managed the COVID pressures. Over $500 million resulted from actions taken by city staff, and $1.2 billion from the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario. In 2021, we have COVID pressures of $1.6 billion, in addition to growth and inflation pressures of $650 million, totaling an opening budget pressure of $2.2 billion. 2021 expects and is optimistic that the projected $1.6 billion COVID pressures will be supported, since we have already secured $740 million. I'd like to share our roadmap to our balanced 2021 budget. Through extensive reviews and analysis of our 2020 COVID experience, we've identified savings, offsets, and revised estimates, which are based on service levels that support and adhere to public health guidelines. This represents the lion's share of the $573 million and reflects our collective efforts to find offsets and preserve city services, albeit based on assumptions and service levels that comply with health guidelines. We've also managed, as in previous years, to absorb our own growth, demand, and inflationary increases and pressures. What is being assumed is government support for the $1.6 billion of COVID pressures, $61 million in refugee costs, and $15 million in supportive housing, totaling $1.7 billion. Of the $1.7 billion of federal and provincial support, as I've mentioned, $740 million has already been confirmed. So on this slide, of that $1.7 billion in financial supports, as I just mentioned, 740 has been secured. The city will need $1.6 billion in support from the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario to address the COVID impacts. The lost revenue in the TTC is the major component of our COVID ask, and this represents $796 million. This lost revenue is triggered by the reduction in transit ridership. Our corporate revenues are also impacted, such as reduced dividends from the Toronto Parking Authority and Toronto Hydro, reduced user fees, and a reduction in MLTT revenues. Not surprisingly, increased public health costs to address the pandemic. We have additional COVID shelter costs of $281 million. We have an increased need in our shelters to accommodate additional shelter sites due to social distancing requirements. And we've increased cleaning costs and PPE costs due to the pandemic at TCHC and in our long-term care facilities. Our other category of $125 million reflects costs across the organization, reflecting PPE and cleaning costs in other city divisions, for example, our emergency services. In addition to the COVID funding, similar to how we've approached our last two budgets, the city expects it will continue to be supported by the Government of Canada on the refugee file for $61 million. And we are also asking for funding supports from the Province of Ontario for supportive housing. So where does the city's revenue come from? This slide reflects where revenues are coming from, but also highlighting where we anticipate to have lost revenues due to COVID. So 37.1% comes from property tax. In 2021, property tax revenue totals $4.5 billion. Federal and provincial funding represents 34% of the city's overall revenue and reflects $2.5 billion in cost share programs, grants, and subsidies, including $61 million for refugees and $15 million for supportive housing. This year, the city has also requested the $1.6 billion in federal and provincial funding to offset the COVID impacts. User fees, the city collects approximately $0.7 billion in user fee revenue, and user fees and fines are expected to be down due to COVID. Land transfer tax is being budgeted at $700 million. There is, however, an additional $100 million included in our COVID ask from other levels of government for lost revenues. Since MLTT is not a predictable source of revenue and is directly correlated to the real estate market in both volume and house prices, it's important to note that the vulnerability of an unpredictable market in 2021 has been addressed. Currently, the data from the Toronto Real Estate Board shows an increase in volume. However, we also had a very strong Q1 pre-COVID in 2020. Other revenue includes dividends from Toronto Hydro, the Toronto Parking Authority, in addition to anticipated lost parking enforcement revenue, just to highlight a few. TTC fares will make up $500 million in revenues, with a revenue loss of $0.7 billion due to the decrease in ridership. The remainder of revenues are from investment income and transfers from capital and reserves, which are unaffected by the pandemic. Now, where does our money go? $3.6 billion is spent on our cost-shared social programs, such as children's services, long-term care homes, public health. $2 billion is spent on emergency services, including fire, paramedics, and police. $1.1 billion in corporate and capital finance costs represents our capital from current contribution, along with our debt servicing requirements. $1 billion will be spent on other city operations, such as affordable housing, city planning, court services, municipal licensing, economic development, parks, forestry, and recreation, to name the majority of them. Governance and corporate services of $800 million includes enabling the frontline services such as 311, and also our accountability officers, the city manager's office, facilities, real estate, and our environment and energy group. Corporate accounts represents expenses incurred on behalf of the entire organization, for example, insurance and employee-related liabilities. And finally, transportation and agencies totaling $800 million combined. Our 2021 budget continues to support existing services. $11.7 billion is being allocated to preserve existing service levels based on assumptions that are consistent with public health guidelines. Based on projections, timelines for the recovery of services may change if public health measures change. $1.6 billion is estimated for additional costs related to COVID-19 and lost revenues as described on slide 21. Even with the significant challenges we face in responding to COVID, we've dedicated $22 million in new and enhanced programs that will build a prosperous Toronto. Approximately $12 million is dedicated to equity responsive investments that include Housing Now initiative, expansion of the Fair Pass program eligibility, community-based crisis response pilot, and an enhancement to the Towards Peace program. The city is continuing to support Cafe TO and Active TO programs, which were introduced in response to COVID. Within our transit system, we are making investments to reduce Wheel-Trans call wait times and promote anti-racism and diversity. In addition, we are investing $34 million in areas to support and prepare the city to build back stronger. As we've made significant progress to our online services, our remote work capabilities, and the evolution of operating in an increasingly digital world, modernizing our technology will improve access, security, and operational efficiencies. Protecting and securing our assets is an area of focus, along with the investment in the technology tools necessary to provide services in a contactless environment. We are making investments to prepare for the opening of the Eglinton Crosstown LRT in 2022. We're making investments on vehicle maintenance and improving vehicle reliability. The budget enhances the commitment in Vision Zero and funding for traffic signals and work zone pilots. And lastly, we are fulfilling a commitment to investing in the year of public art. As we look beyond 2021, there is sufficient uncertainty towards the city's COVID response requirements, public health measures, service resumptions, and the extent of federal and provincial funding support. As all projections and budgets are supported by assumptions, we are assuming a range for the potential pressures and demands on the city's operating budget in 2022. The range being $1.1 billion to $1.8 billion. We will continue to monitor COVID impacts and supports throughout 2021 and update our assumptions accordingly. We will continue to work with the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario to determine the necessary funding supports to address the unprecedented pressures the city faces. The City of Toronto's residential tax increase is 0.7%, in line with inflation. Consistent with council policy, the commercial and industrial rate increases are a fraction of the residential rate. The city is not passing along the full budget increase to the business classes in order to bring the business class tax ratios down to levels consistent with provincial legislation and council policy by 2023. There is no increase in multi-residential properties in compliance with provincial legislation. This translates to an average tax increase of $22 to the average home. As approved in 2019, there's an incremental increase in the city building fund of 1.5%. This dedicated levy leverages $7.3 billion in housing and transit infrastructure investments. This increase represents a $47 increase to the average tax bill. For an average home valued at $698,000, the average property tax bill will be $3,201. This slide demonstrates how an average property tax amount will be spent. And as you can see, 67% of the average tax bill is spent on keeping our City of Toronto safe, moving, maintained, and growing. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it over to Steve.
Thanks, Heather. Let me get into the capital budget. I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to thank all finance staff across city programs and agencies, including our staff in financial planning. As Heather had mentioned, extraordinary efforts have been undertaken both in developing this year's budget, but also throughout the past year as we managed the financial challenges presented. Moving to capital, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to present the staff recommended 10-year capital budget and plan, which will guide decisions on what investments we will make towards purchase, build, and repair of city infrastructure. As Heather had mentioned, the city's 10-year capital plan totals $44.7 billion when you combine the tax and rate budgets. I'll focus on the 10-year capital plan of $29.1 billion for the tax-supported programs, as the rate-supported budgets that include Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and the Parking Authority were approved by Council in Consistent with the operating budget, 4 guiding principles were applied during the development of the capital. Firstly, the capital plan continues and builds upon investments committed as part of the 2020 budget, which included significant increases in stated repair funding for transit and housing, as well as other capital priorities. There are also new investments being recommended within this year's capital plan, again for transit and housing, but also for environmental and modernization initiatives. Secondly, Chris spoke to the importance of our partnerships with the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario, and the capital plan reflects these valued partnerships to fund vital programs and services. In total, $4.8 billion in federal and provincial funding will continue to be leveraged for investment in key areas such as mobility and housing. The plan also includes $34 million in added funding provided through the COVID resilience infrastructure stream for investments in parks, facilities, and long-term care homes. Third, and consistent with Heather's comments on financial sustainability, we are again focused on a capital plan that is both achievable and affordable. Planning of capital projects includes a lens on what can be delivered within budgeted timeframes. The city balances the need for capital infrastructure maintenance and improvements with what is both affordable and deliverable within a given timeframe. And lastly, the city continues its capital modernization efforts with a key focus over the next year towards development of a capital asset management. Consistent with provincial requirements, the plan will first apply to what the province has categorized as core city assets within Toronto Water and Transportation Services, and will then be expanded across all city assets. Next slide. So how do we better execute a capital plan that is both achievable and affordable? One, we remain committed to improving capital spend rates. Our capital planning process looks to ensure that projects are budgeted when they are construction ready. This will improve our spend rate, but also ensure that available capital funding is allocated to both where it is needed and where it can be spent. We are also providing more flexibility to allow for multi-year commitments with the ability to accelerate funding where we demonstrate that we can complete work ahead of schedule. We're continuing to expand the implementation of stage gating across the organization. As a city, we're committed to keeping the debt service ratio below 15% in each year of the 10-year planning period. The capital plan will continue to leverage federal and provincial funding that accounts for approximately 16% of our total capital plan. And maintaining our debt service ratio has also ensured we continue to receive positive credit ratings, which further enhances our current low interest rate environment. We've been able to benefit from the low interest rates with overall debt funding increasing compared to last year's plan while continuing to adhere to our debt service ratio. The funding increase has been further supported through our success in issuing both social and green bonds to finance capital infrastructure. We have now issued 3 green bonds, and we are the first Canadian government to issue a social bond. We plan to continue to issue both green and social bonds in 2021. The focus on achievability and affordability builds on the actions that began as part of last year's budget process. We have seen some positive results arising from these changes in capital planning. Even in the midst of COVID-19 and the related impacts on capital delivery, we've seen material improvements in our capital spend rates. As of third quarter reporting, we were projecting a 2020 capital spend rate of 81% compared to an average of 62.5% that we had experienced over the prior 5 years. Our capital spending pattern for the first 9 months typically ranges between 32 and 37% of the total council approved capital budget. In 2020, we experienced a 48% spend rate, again, comparing favorably to past experience. We aim to continue to see improvements through the way we execute a capital plan that is both achievable and affordable. Staff are recommending a 10-year capital plan for the city's tax-supported programs that totals $29.1 billion in planned capital expenditures. The plan continues to build on the successes achieved as part of the 2020 budget process and through the planned continued 1.5% increase in the city building fund. Through the city building fund, we can support $7.3 billion in funding for critical capital investment in transit and housing. This now represents the city's largest source of capital funding, reflecting a quarter of the city's total capital program. The budget also continues with our planned investments in TCHC building repairs. The capital plan continues with the $1.6 billion in funding added last year for TCH needs, and also extends the support by an added year with a further $160 million investment planned in 2030. As reflected in last year's plan, the continued commitment enables the city to leverage a further $1.3 billion in co-investment through federal partnerships. We have also been able to build on the advancements introduced last year. And the current capital plan has increased by over 1.1 billion in funding when compared to our previous 10-year plan. This increase has enabled the city to make investments in areas such as mobility, with 215 million added investments in base transit needs. The budget also includes an acceleration of nearly 800 million in funding into the first 5 years of the capital plan to address these needs fast. We've also added a further 83 million towards maintenance of city bridges and 39 million as part of Move to Yale. For housing, in addition to 160 million investment in TCHC building repair, the budget includes 329 million in added federal, provincial, and city funding towards housing. On the environment, the city's capital plan includes an added 193 million in initiatives that support the climate change emergency. For modernization, 226 million has been added for design and implementation of Modern TO's workplace modernization program, as well as technology investments, increasing access to city services. The capital plan continues to incorporate federal and provincial funding, and we have added further funding for housing initiatives, as well as funds provided through the COVID resilience. Lastly, the capital plan is balanced and affordable. For the second year in a row, we've maintained our debt service ratio under 15% for all years within the 10-year planning period, and we've included an inflationary increase to our level of capital from current funding. That said, and as Chris had mentioned, support from the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario continues to be critical to offset COVID impacts on the city's operating budget. In the event that adequate funding is not forthcoming in 2021, material adjustments to the capital budget will be required through a reduction in our planned CFC funding. Next slide. As mentioned, the tax-supported capital plan totals 29.1 billion over the 10-year planning period and will guide decisions on what investments will be made to purchase, build, and repair city infrastructure. Let's look at the chart on how the money is invested. First, I'd like to draw your attention to the 13.3 billion investment in transit. This represents 46% of our total capital program and builds on the investments committed to last year that nearly doubled our historical investment towards transit SOGR. The city is also committed to spending 2.9 billion in housing, coupled with a further 4.4 billion investment through foregone revenue in the form of land value and financial incentives. This funding will be used to support the development of 20,000 affordable homes and will move the city towards the goal of supporting 40,000 new affordable homes under the Housing TO 2020-2030 Action Plan. To create the remaining 20,000 new affordable homes, we will require added investments from the federal and provincial government. We are also investing a further 5.2 billion in mobility through investments in road and bridge repair and in safety and cycling as part of the transportation budget. The city will also spend 3.2 billion on the environment. This includes initiatives within parks, environment and energy, as well as the TRCA. The city will also be investing 1.3 billion in real estate for projects such as Modern TO, as well as the 700 million in emergency services that include fire, paramedic. The capital plan also includes 2.5 billion investment across other city programs and agencies such as services, library, and technology. The left side of the chart details how the capital plan is funded. As noted, the City Building Fund now reflects the largest source of capital funding at 25% and is applied against transit and housing initiatives. Debt funding totals 6.6 billion and benefits from lower interest rates in 2021 and the use of green and social bonds while ensuring that our debt service costs remain under 15% in each year of the plan. There's a further 3.7 billion in capital from current funding. In 2021 alone, the operating budget will contribute nearly 340 million in CFC funding to capital, reflecting an inflationary increase above 2020 CFC funding levels. As previously noted, the capital plan continues to leverage funding partnerships with the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario, with total combined funding of 4.8 billion, reflecting 16% of total capital. Reserve funds account for 2.5 billion in capital plan funding. This level of funding is consistent with commitments against city reserves where annual contributions are made, often through the operating budget, to support planned capital investments. An example includes fleet reserve contributions that support vehicle procurement plans over the course of the capital budget. The capital plan also utilizes 1.2 billion in recoverable debt for projects that will return savings or an added revenue, such as our building retrofit projects, as well as approximately 3 billion in various other sources, such as development charge funding and Section 37. Next slide. State of good repair traditionally reflects the majority of capital spending within the city's 10-year plan. Even with the level of state of good repair funding and future year commitments, staff continue to project an SOGR backlog that will grow over the next 10 years from $6.9 billion to $14.8 billion. This growth arises from the current age of city infrastructure and the SOGR impact of added capital needs identified through the TTC's capital investment plan, with future vehicle needs alone reflecting 2/3 of the TTC backlog. Addressing the SOGR backlog is a key capital priority. From 2015 to 2019, the city spent $7.2 billion on SOGR that was used to address infrastructure needs across key areas such as transit, housing, libraries, arenas, and community centers. As part of the 2020 capital budget process last year, significant gains were made towards addressing the city's SOGR backlog. The infusion of incremental capital funding through the enhancement of the city building fund enabled the city to nearly double our investment in TTC-based capital needs, increasing our 10-year investment from over $6 billion to just under $12 billion. In 2020, the city also committed to $1.6 billion in funding towards TCHC building repairs that enabled us to leverage a further $1.3 billion in co-investment from the Government of Canada. The 2021 capital budget continues to advance commitments made as part of last year's process. A total of $16.1 billion will be invested in SOGR over the next 10 years. This includes continued and advanced commitments in transit and TCHC, and also makes further investments in funding towards infrastructure, such as city bridges. Moving forward, staff will continue to explore and identify opportunities to further address infrastructure needs. We will also leverage the work to be completed on asset management planning, building on the practices in Toronto Water and Transportation Services to ensure a consistent approach across all city programs that will ultimately provide a uniform strategic lens on how we invest in capital infrastructure across the organization. Next slide. As mentioned, we have both added and accelerated funding to this year's capital plan. Similar to the operating budget, there has been a focus on equity on many of our added capital investments. Within mobility, an additional $244 million in funding for easier access will address accessibility of Warden and Islington stations and ensure all TTC stations are accessible. We are investing a further $489 million through a combination of federal, provincial, and city funding on housing investments, including the continued investment towards the state of good repair of TCHC buildings, as well as investments in Housing Now, modular housing, rental housing, and the Rapid Housing Initiative. Further investments are also being made in community initiatives, such as the Parkdale Hub projects. Added investments are being made in modernization and transformation, including $226 million in Modern TO's Workplace Modernization Project, which will unlock value in 8 city properties that can be leveraged for affordable housing and other city needs. And lastly, investments are being made towards climate change emergency, with $193 million in added investments in sustainable energy plans, building retrofits, and the Renewable Thermal Energy Program. Thank you. I'll now turn the presentation over to back to Heather.
Thanks, Steve. So this has been a challenging budget, to say the least, shaped by the impacts of COVID-19. We have seen added costs to deliver services in a safe manner, while revenue sources traditionally leveraged to offset inflation and growth costs, they're expected to decline. One of the key principles of our budget was to manage the impacts of COVID-19 while preserving service levels consistent with public health guidelines. In addition, there is a recommendation for a further $56 million in new investments focused on equity and building a prosperous Toronto. All of this is achieved while keeping our property taxes affordable, which we heard from residents was a priority. The capital budget reflects the increased city building levy, which enables us to further advance on our commitments towards transit and housing infrastructure demands. This budget also adds and accelerates funding in key areas such as transit, housing, environment, and modernization, as Steve just mentioned. As Chris mentioned, we do have an alternative strategy to balance in the event funding from the governments of Canada and the province of Ontario are not received. The options available to us aren't our preference. And as Steve mentioned, we would materially impact our capital plan and reserves. We are optimistic that we will continue to build on the 2020 collaborative success with both the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario to secure a sustainable financial future. And as Chris mentioned, committed ongoing support from the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario are critical to ensure financial sustainability throughout COVID and into the future. I just want to elaborate a little bit on the balancing strategy. We signaled to Council back in December when we asked for a deviation of accounting policy so that the 2019 surpluses could be put into the tax stabilization reserve in the event that we didn't receive the supports from the other levels of government. We have been planning prudently to have a contingency plan in the event that this support is not received. Finally, Chris, Steve, and I have extended our thanks to staff, but quite honestly, it has taken the efforts of staff at all levels across all city divisions and agencies to contribute to the budget and make what is an extremely challenging COVID budget look simple. We can't say thank you enough for all the efforts that have brought this budget together during these very challenging and unprecedented times. So today's the budget launch. Budget materials, as the chair mentioned at the onset of the meeting, will be posted publicly this afternoon on the city's website. This will provide City Council an opportunity to review budget materials in advance of the program and agency presentations on January 20th to the 22nd. The public will have the opportunity to participate in deputations January 25th and January 26th in two ways, in a virtual format or written submissions to the Budget Committee. With the Budget Committee ultimately being considered by Budget Committee, Exec Committee, and voted on by Council at a special City Council meeting February 18th. We acknowledge engaging in a virtual budget process is new for all of us. City staff are available to help support and address any queries that you may have throughout the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. And again, thank you, Chris and Steve, for your presentations. It is now time to look at questions from committee and visiting councillors. So I noticed a number of visiting councillors who are with us. Once my screen is up, if you just want to raise your hand. Again, these will be questions on the presentation. So I'll start with visiting councillors first. I see Councillor Wong Tam, Ford, and Perks. So we'll do Councillor Wong Tam, Councillor Ford, Councillor Perks. And if there's any others, then we'll go into committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the city staff for this incredible presentation. I know that there's more to come. And without a doubt, I just want to take this opportunity to just acknowledge that you haven't had a break, and this is historic. And my question with respect to the rebalancing of the budget, if the alternative or if the desired strategies don't come to fruition, meaning that the provincial and federal government step in to help us balance our budget to meet the budget gaps, can you elaborate, Heather? Because you spoke to it very generally, but can you elaborate on the strategies to balance that budget without the provincial government support?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor, as you say, I alluded to it. In December, we requested from Council approval to put the 2019 surplus into the tax stabilization reserve, and that was just over 214 million. Normally, Council policy would have us directing that primarily to the capital funding reserve. So that was a signal that we were trying to keep money set aside. In 2020, if you recall, we also signaled in our reports in July and in September that we were holding back on our CFC contributions into the capital plan. And the reason for that was to ensure, again, that we had a safety net to fall back on. And so when we look at the amount of CFC that we held back, we look at the surplus, we look at the CFC contribution that is budgeted for in our balanced budget, and we look at our provincial gas tax amounts. When you combine all of those together, it more than offsets the 856 million, which is the remaining gap that we're calling our COVID gap. But it's an actual fact COVID plus the 61 million for refugees and the 15 million for supportive housing. So 856 is the number we're targeting, and we have ensured that within the tax stabilization fund right now, along with our CFC contributions and our provincial gas tax contribution for 2021, that we can completely offset that 856.
Thank you, Heather. That's very helpful. And with respect to the date that we need to make this decision, because obviously you've put into motion, or at least into some planning, some contingencies, but because council needs to approve a balanced budget, and we all do, am I correct to assume that we have to know from the provincial and federal governments what they plan to do, when those monies plan to come flowing in, before or on, hopefully not on, but February the 18th. Is that correct, or do we have some lead time afterwards?
So through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, the way we're looking at it is that similar to how we actually did the refugee ask of the federal government in the last 2 years. So what we did in that instance is that we still deemed the budget to be balanced, and we knew that in the event that those funds would not come in, we would draw from a reserve. And so we're taking that exact same approach, although far more material, and we're saying that we have the sufficient amounts to offset in the event that the province and the federal government don't come to the table with the remaining amounts. So we look at what we have provided today, presented today, as balanced. So specific to your question, we are confident and comfortable that we've provided a balanced budget, but we have a contingency plan. And our contingency plan is throughout the year, we will monitor and we will be prudent in managing the CFC contributions into the capital plan, just like we did in 2020. And we signaled to council in July of 2020 that we were holding back of the CFCs. So that is our backstop measure, and we do look at it as a balanced budget.
Thank you. And my final question is regarding the $480 million worth of savings and efficiencies that staff have secured so far. Out of that quantum, is there any concern that perhaps the gapping measures that are in place may erode the level of service that goes out to Torontonians?
So through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, what we did back in 2020 for our budget is we eliminated the concept of gapping. We, in actual fact, revised our projections and our budgets to be based on our actual spending trends. And so we became focused on the outcomes that we were targeting and ensuring that we had the adequate resources. So we don't actually do gapping. And we are looking, the budgets that we've put forward, as I qualified, it is full of assumptions. And our assumptions, we feel, are informed by our 2020 COVID experience and the service levels that we have experienced in 2020 are continuing in 2021, given public health measures and constraints.
Thank you, Councillor.
Okay, thank you very much.
Next,
thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Councillor Ford for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and echoing the previous councillor's sentiment of thanks to staff for this and your incredibly hard work, especially this year. To the the provincial federal government conversation, in 2020 we were very successful in securing funds needed to balance out our pressures in 2020 with the work of the mayor and council and of course staff. What preliminary conversations have staff had with provincial and federal officials? And are we confident that the $856 million gap would be covered?
I'll start and then Heather can follow up. I mean, we have met with the Secretary of Cabinet, we've met with the Deputy Minister of Finance and numerous other deputy ministers to not just talk about what we've experienced in 2020, but to make clear the challenge that we know we're going to have in 2021. So, I mean, they're not in a position to obviously confirm that the investment will be made. However, they were certainly put on notice of the challenge, and Heather's group has done a great job of sharing with them modeling information to back up our needs for 2021. So, I mean, we have that working relationship with them, and so that, from an administrative standpoint, they're aware of our need and they're aware of how it is that we arrive at the need. And then, of course, you know, we need to work effectively with the mayor and the office, who then takes the matter to the political tables, and as we've seen, has proven to be successful, certainly to this point, and we're going to continue to support him in his efforts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chris. So my second question is, of course, kind of putting our feet to the fire in 2020 when COVID hit in March, declaration of state of emergency, and our kind of budgeting process was kind of thrown into a bit of a tailspin in the city, or our finances, I should say. And in terms of the mitigating factors that we used then to kind of, I think it was the $573 million gap that we, or pressure that we mitigated. What strategies are we going to be using in 2021 that may differ from 2020?
Chris, I can jump in through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor, there's a wide gamut of approaches we've taken. And again, I can't emphasize enough the public health measures create a set of assumptions that we are basing our numbers on. And so first and foremost, I will say that the concrete actions are that the non-union eliminated its salary increase and its pay for performance. As you know, we had a voluntary separation program, and so the savings from that program are coming into 2021. In addition to that, we are looking at the reality of when programs we think will resume based on our experience in 2020. And so a lot of the actions that we took in 2020 are being repeated, except for the couple that I just mentioned. I think it's really important, though, to note that the way we built our budget, as I mentioned, is focused on outcomes. And so we have looked at it around what outcomes are we trying to achieve? When do we feel that they are realistic in achieving in the sense of public health measures? And what resources will be needed and when? And so because of that, we were able, again, on a set of assumptions, to create what we feel is to the best of our ability right now, a real perspective of where we think we'll be in resource requirements for 2021.
Okay, thanks, Heather. And then shifting over to the capital side, I'm not too sure how much time I have left. I can't see the time. But to throw out this question, so what was our capital spend last year?
I'll ask Steve to jump in.
Thanks, Heather. I'll have to pull in the exact dollars that we've projected for 2020, but it was in line of about 81% of our capital plan. Okay. If you just give me a moment, I can get you the actual dollar amount that we were projecting.
Okay, no problem. You can get me that offline. I think I have about 10 more seconds here. And then my next question is, of course, COVID has presented a multitude of issues and pressures on our city and society. But in one other way, I think it creates somewhat of an opportunity to really invest in our capital in 2021 in terms of transit or whatnot. So is there a push to make those capital investments?
That's your last question, Councillor.
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Actually, Councillor, I'm glad you brought that up, because in 2020, if you recall, we did a recast of the 10-year capital plan, and the purpose of the recast was to, in actual fact, tackle the 60% achievability that the city had been experiencing in previous years. And we did it a recast to ensure that we were better projecting when we could do projects, but with the flexibility that if there was a need to accelerate, the capital plan had that flexibility built in. During COVID, we were actually able to do just that with roads, with our road maintenance. And so we actually accelerated projects that were supposed to be in the out years. We brought them into 2020 to do just what we had intended by recasting the capital plan. And so there is flexibility built in. And to Steve's comment, we know that we have achieved over 80%, which is unprecedented for the city. So
Absolutely.
we do feel that the capital recast, even in a pandemic, was actually quite successful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Next, we'll go to Councillor Perks for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess this is to the CFO. If I understood your answer to Councillor Wong Tam's question, the budget that you have put in front of us is balanced and has put money into the reserve so that we can manage things if we don't get the money that we hope for from the federal provincial government. So that would mean that the capital plan you're showing us today assumes you don't get the money, but if the money comes, then you put more back in. Am I understood that correctly?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Actually, do you mind, Councillor, I need to tweak your understanding just slightly. So
Please.
you are correct that we have put money in a reserve, but we haven't put the entire balancing strategy in the reserve. What we're saying is the budget is balanced on the assumption that we receive the other levels of government funding. If that doesn't happen, it's a combination of not contributing into the capital plan, the current year's CFC contribution, and pulling from reserves.
Okay, so the budget that you're presenting to us shows the capital plan as if the federal money came?
That's correct.
Okay. Are you going to be providing a document to council that shows which capital projects and programs are at risk if that federal and provincial money does not come? And if so, when?
Mr. Chair, just to share with you what we normally do in a normal non-pandemic year around the capital plan is once the budget is approved, we then go to projects and we look at state of readiness, and we would then assign the CFC allocation. So
I understand, but we get
I know.
department by department a list of what we expect to do. And is that list, are we going to get a separate document telling us what's at risk if the federal and provincial money does not flow?
So through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, what we would have is a grouping of projects rather than individual line by line projects. So those types of projects would be our state of good repair, our recreation centers, the maintenance to our real estate. We know from a grouping the types of projects, but we haven't necessarily gone into the granular detail.
Well, I'm going to have to pursue that later. Okay, thank you. In the summer, City Council passed a direction requiring staff to bring us a program for diverting mental health calls from the police to a CAHOOTS style program. I see in here $1.7 million for social development. Is that program?
I think Denise is on the call. I'm going to ask her to assist.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Councillor. That is for that program.
Okay. Final question. As you know, every budget time I ask what slippage there has been in our original climate plan. What slippage are we seeing this year? How far behind are we now?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor, I'll offer one piece of information and then I'll ask EED to share some information. But in our capital plan, Steve highlighted that in actual fact, we've added We have a net addition of 195 million into our capital plan to target capital and climate initiatives. But specific to the environmental program, I hope Jim is on the line, and if not, Councillor, we can talk to you offline.
Thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm just curious if, oh, there's Jim. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Just to briefly, the major impact in 2020 was our inability to produce the net zero plan as we had anticipated. We are currently working on that, and we'll be bringing an update to Council in 2021.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that.
I just want to make sure I understand that. So this budget that is proposed and in front of us doesn't allocate money to catch that up, but rather you're going to be bringing us a policy document mid-year so that we can give direction to catch you up in 2022. Is that what I understood you to mean?
Correct. I think the budget, the forecast that we have anticipates that we will be back to a more or less pre-COVID level by 2022.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you, Councillor. Are there any other visiting councillors who want to ask questions? Seeing none, if I have missed you, just put on your mic, but it doesn't look like I see any visiting. Let's take it into committee. I have Councillor McKelvey to begin with questions. So, Councillor, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is along the same theme of some of the questions you've already had about the $860 million, and it sounds like you'll be assessing what those projects are based on readiness. But I guess my question is, are you ready to, we're not going to get a blank check from the government. I think that's very unlikely. They're just going to hand us a check for $860 million, and their relief may be themed or targeted. So are we ready to pick and choose projects that can fit into what their mandates are and what they're proposing to fund?
So through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, I'll start and then I'll ask Steve to jump in. Again, when we look at our capital plan, so we know that there's monies sitting in our reserve right now, and those monies were put in intentionally to address a COVID backstop. And so the reserves, we would have to make a decision. We would have to bring to council a recommendation as to whether or not we would tap into the reserve before we would in actual fact tackle the current year's CFC and provincial gas tax. So that is still a decision that needs to be addressed. I would say though that the 740 that has been secured, the province has a different fiscal year end, and they have committed the monies that take them up to the end of their fiscal year end. And so in our discussions with other levels of government, we do feel that there has been support implied that they need to address in their next budget. We understand the provincial budget, would be somewhere in either late Q1 or early Q2. So I do think that we have time, which is why, we've got options available to us, and I think we can strategize around tapping into a reserve without hitting the capital plan to bridge us if that was the needed decision. So
okay, so we can still start preparing all the RFPs and get ready for all the work that needs to happen.
That's our intention.
Okay, and then do we have, as we prepare that and we look at it, so $860 million, if you take like the broadband multipliers, they assume around 9.4 jobs per $1 million in capital spending. So $860 million looks like 8,084 jobs. So are we working on refining those sorts of numbers, and do we have our own kind of multipliers in the city of Toronto? Because both levels of government right now are really interested in getting people back to work, and I think that's going to be a large part of their funding criteria. So where are we at with our internal understanding of what our dollars buy?
So a couple of three, Mr. Chair. Councillor, I'll give you a couple of my perspectives, and then if economic development is on, they might be able to add something. But looking at, from an investor perspective in the banks, they are looking at our numbers, not necessarily dollars per GDP, but they in actual fact look at debt per capita. And so they look at, for every dollar we spend, what is the output from an output into the economy. And I would say that that is one of the numbers that we watch. The investors watch that, the banks watch that. Obviously, we do look at our spending per capita as well. Our spend per capita is going up $175 per capita, and that's because of COVID. We also know that there's information from the markets that demonstrates that construction is still, despite the COVID experience, construction has been booming, and that jobs are coming out of that construction activity, which is one of the reasons why we do really want to promote not hitting our capital plan. But if economic development is on the line, I welcome them to contribute to that response.
Okay, maybe they can get back to me on that because I'm not seeing anybody here. So I'm hoping we'll go to another round, but I'll try to squeeze one more in here. You spoke about the equity review panel, and I was just wondering, I don't know that much about their process. So is that review by them happening in parallel, or has that already happened and their comments have been taken into account into the budget? So how do they interface with what we're doing?
So through you, Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask Denise to explain that process.
That was your last question, Councillor.
Thank you, Heather. And I'm happy to have Steve join in as well, as financial planning is a critical part of this process. But essentially, Councillor, the review panel looks at the recommended business cases, as well as any changes were recommended in the budget, and comments on that before the staff recommended budget is moved forward. So it happens in advance of this time and process within the budget process.
Thank you, Denise. Do we have any other committee members who'd like to ask questions? Councillor Carroll, you're up.
Thank you, Chief. First of all, the administrative piece. I note that on the general website, we have the presentation in our portal. Out on Timis for the general public, I see the presentation, but I don't see the divisions yet. For the public who might be listening in, can you estimate for us when the budget notes on each division and agency will show up on the website?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Councillor, I understand that they are to be uploaded by the end of today.
Yay. A little time to read them before a question. I don't want to ask a lot of questions before I move into those, but I do want to return to the thing that everyone's asking about, this outstanding piece. Well, Councillor Wong Tam asked one of my questions about it. When do you have to make this decision? And it sounds like you can sort of move along in stages and keep working with the other governments, and you have a little bit of leeway there. So that gives me a little comfort. However, I do want to go back to a question that Councillor Perks asked you, which is, can we see a list? I would call it a menu of where we would go in capital. What is in jeopardy if we don't receive funds from other governments? I'm not clear on your answer. Are we being asked to give you the delegated authority to decide? Because my question would be, when do I get to review that list? Because my community may in some cases think the state of good repair is where they want you to go, and we'll do the shiny thing in future years. Others might say, we need the shiny thing right now. I can put off repairing a water fountain. I think there needs to be a bit of community input into the capital plan if we're going to have to unpack it with no government support coming our way.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor, I think before we would even get to a decision surrounding the capital programs, as I mentioned, I think there's the conversation to be had around, do we actually impact the capital plan, or do we actually go to the tax stabilization reserve where we've intentionally put funding in? So I think we would come back to this committee to talk about budget impacts and bring to you information that we have around where we are in our negotiations with the other levels of government, how far along we are in the capital plan from the perspective of timing. So that, as I mentioned, we have to look at the capital plan, assess the project's timing. As you know, we tend to have a slower construction period over the winter months, and then we get busier in the summer months. So I think it's about informing what are our options based on the timing of the construction projects. I think as Councilor McKelvey quite rightly pointed out, it's around the planning of the RFP for the construction pieces as well. So I would think that we have to come back and ask you for your recommendations and your input around which part of our balancing strategy should be tackled first.
Right. And then if we get down to it, you might be able to, if we go there, what I'm hoping is that your intergovernmental strategy is successful. But if we had to go there, it could maybe come to us in baskets where there could be an opportunity for committee deliberation. So
Through you, Mr. Chair. Actually, Councillor, you kind of broke up at the tail end of your comment.
Oh, I'm just saying that you're successful intergovernmental, really am. But if we had to go to that capital plan, could I anticipate that you would take all of those things into account? You know, tender schedule and coordination of capital is something we're always grappling with, but that when you get down to it, when you have to do those, that there will be a point at which if we're having to go into the capital program and start mining through it, they might come in tranches, baskets, whatever you want to call them, and there would be one opportunity for us to deliberate.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think, Councillor, it's a great suggestion. I think what we have to do is bucket what are the opportunities, the timing of the opportunities, and again, you know, as I've mentioned, the balancing strategy isn't just one element. It is around council making a decision around how do we, in actual fact, stage that backstop in the event that that's necessary. There is an awful lot of work, as you can appreciate, that city staff already have underway that helps plan out their next year. And so that information for us, then we can compile, summarize, and then bring for a recommendation. And that recommendation needs to be tied into how do we tackle the backstop? In what order do we, in actual fact, tackle that backstop strategy?
Thanks, Councillor.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from committee members? Seeing none, Councillor McKelvey, I know.
Councillor, Mr. Budget Chief, I've had my hand up.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Layton, I didn't see that. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we've gone through this this budgeting strategy and kind of the sequence of what would happen enough, but I'm curious about the timing. So last year we made a $60 million ask to the federal government for support for refugee resettlement. When was it? When did the city actually get the money?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor, in actual fact, the way it has worked with the federal government is we have had to demonstrate the need, and what we do is we make a submission and this submission is reimbursed. It is based on ongoing conversations that inform us throughout the year. So we haven't yet received our Q4 payment, but we have a verbal commitment that they are going to, that they continue to support the program.
And is the Q4 commitment the bulk of the money, or like for the annually, or it's been given to us throughout?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we did receive an amount that took us from January to the end of September. So the first 3 quarters of our fiscal year was in actual fact one submission, and we received payment for that.
So when did we receive that commitment or payment? At what point in the year?
I'm going to ask Steve to answer. I think he has the dates.
Yeah, I can jump in. I don't have the exact date, Councillor, but it was roughly around August, September timeframe is when the commitment was provided and the funds actually flowed around September, October timeframe.
But in that case, they're looking for when, so that we can show them receipts, correct? Is that a fair assessment?
So through the chair, we were able to provide the expected or the incurred costs over the first portion of the year. And it essentially substantiated the need and it allowed for the flow of funds to come after.
Okay, I'm just trying to get a better understanding of when we can expect the federal government or the provincial government to come in with support. Because if we debated the $60 million in February, and it was clear that we needed that we would need the money then, but we didn't receive it till the following September.
For you, Mr. Chair, actually, Councillor, it really is hard to use 2020 as an example on the refugee file because our previous year experience was different. The fact is COVID impacted both the federal government and obviously the province. That goes without saying. So the federal government was very focused on the COVID response, and the refugee file was not a priority at that time. So I would say that comparing our experience in 2020 on the refugee file wouldn't be the normal basis of comparison, but I get the point of your question in the sense of when will we have comfort. We had a commitment from the province of Ontario back in August for a certain amount of funding. And if you think back to when we started highlighting the pressures, that was back in July, June, July, to the provincial and federal government. So the timing was actually much smaller than if you compare it to the refugee program. So there is conversations that are going on right now that, as I mentioned earlier, just acknowledge the fact that the fiscal year end is different, that they're dealing with an April 1st fiscal year end, hoping to deliver a budget sometime in the month of March.
Okay, you raise a really important point there, I think, about us treating 2020 differently than other years. But we're still using that as the point to measure or to budget for 2021. Why aren't we using the 2019 benchmarks rather than 2020? Because in a lot of in many divisions, it will look like we're maintaining the same level of service, but in actuality, it will be quite a bit further behind. So we're still budgeting from actuals, but we're budgeting from an actuals year that was quite different than the normal year.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's why I was highlighting the fact that the budget is full of assumptions, but it's also informed by public health measures, and to the best of our ability. We were well in the second wave when this budget was finalized before bringing it here today. So that has informed the assumptions that have been layered into creating the budget. The public health measures, we all know that COVID isn't disappearing in 2021. Our 2020 COVID experience is what has been driving the assumptions, and the public health measures that we've been complying with is driving what we think programs are going to be able to deliver.
So if I may take the liberty of a final question, this is about the Alternative Safety Response Program. The number is 1.5 million. Are we confident that, like, without any details of what this pilot actually is, are we confident that that's enough money? Can you compare that to another jurisdiction that has taken a similar approach and assure us that that's enough money to actually see a successful program?
So I'm going to ask Denise to respond to that.
Through the chair, the funds that are earmarked in the 2021 recommended budget is for development. It is not for the implementation of the new service. The service is recommended to be implemented in 2022 and will have a different budget attached to the pilot proposal. This report is coming to Executive Committee on January 27th, and we'll have further detail. But you're absolutely right, Councillor. What you see in front of you is the development cost for the proposed service, not the implementation cost of the new service model.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions at all from committee members? Councillor McKelvey, you had expressed an interest in a second round, I believe. I don't know if there's interest in that, or your questions were answered.
Please. No, if possible, they're short.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, are you allowing a second round?
Yeah, I think, under the circumstances, I think it would be prudent to have an extra round, if that's okay with the committee members, of course. We do have okay. So why don't we do a second round if that's okay with everyone? So I see pretty much, we'll start with Councillor Wong Tam, Councillor Prutza, Ford, and then Councillor Perks, and we'll go into committee again. Okay, Councillor Wong Tam.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Chair. Heather, if I can just ask this question about the small business subclass. There has been an announcement from the province that municipalities will be permitted to create this new subclass. I believe the regulations haven't come out yet, but recognizing the struggle of small businesses on main streets and avenues across the city, we don't want to necessarily wait too long. I don't think so, especially not to 2021, not to 2022, I should say, because those businesses won't make it. Would we be ready to introduce a small business subclass in the 2021 budget if those regulations drop, for example, tomorrow or the following day or next week?
So through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, I'll start and then I'll ask Casey to join in. And as I think the key element to what you've just mentioned is we've landed this budget and the provincial regulations have not yet been made public. So it puts us in a very challenging position to be able to respond to regulations that we don't know what they look like. But Casey can expand a little bit more as to why that proves to be challenging from a time perspective.
Thank you, Heather. And through you, Mr. Budget Chair, thank you. And to Councillor Wong Tam, thanks for your question. And Heather is absolutely right in that the key regulations that we would require to understand how a small business tax class can be A, defined, and B, funded, those regulations have not yet been enacted. And in order for us to really understand the impacts of a class and what could be in that class and who would benefit, how that tax relief would be funded, we really don't have those answers. And so in order for us to adopt tax rates as part of the budget process, basically we need that information by February the 7th, February the 11th, in order that council can adopt the budget on February 18th. Our understanding right now is that that provincial regulation will not be released in that time frame. So that puts us in a difficult position to adopt this class. Not to mention that we have not had the opportunity to consult with the business sector on what we might be proposing for a business class. So right now, a staff report to executive committee that will be considered next week, January 27th, is recommending that we study this issue in 2021 and implement in 2022.
Thank you, that's helpful. So just so I entirely capture this, because there's a lot of moving details. If the province does not provide the regulations by February the 11th, then we will not be in a position, City Council, the City of Toronto will not be in a position to introduce that new subclass. Consultation stand put aside for the moment. We just can't do it without the regulations. So it's critical that the regulations come out by no later than February the 11th. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We do not have authority to adopt a class that has not yet been defined. So the regulation would define the class, establish that class, and make it available to municipalities to adopt by bylaw. So without that regulation, we can't actually adopt the class.
Okay, thank you. That's
You're correct on you're correct on your dates.
Thank you. And with respect to the Create TO sites, I just want to dive into this a little bit because there are 8 identified priority sites. And is there a list of, well, as opposed to prioritizing all 8 sites, I think it's difficult to do all of them concurrently. Have the staff dove into the 8 sites further to identify which is their number 1 or number 2 sites that they want to work on in 2021? Is that information
Mr.
available?
Chair, I'll ask Josie if somebody from Create TO is here, or if Pat Matozo, or if you'd like to take the question.
I will take it, and through her and Councillor Wong-Tam, what we've done with Create TO is there is a report that's coming in June in Q2 regarding the 8 sites. In that report, it'll be more specific around the city building requirements and the priorities of those sites, but they will be working with every councillor at the same time and doing public consultation prior. Hope that answers it for now.
Thank you, Councillor.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Next, we'll go to Councillor Perruzza for questions. Councillor Perruzza, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask really briefly, I've been following here. The COVID impacts and sort of the COVID, the way COVID is changing our notion of the workplace, people working from home, that kind of thing. What does that mean for us in terms of sort of the commercial component of our revenues, obviously, and B, sort of the overall impact of that. I like how many people come into the downtown core? How many people used to come into the downtown core pre-COVID? Does anybody have that answer?
So if I can, through the chief, I know from a transit standpoint, we're in and around 25% ridership compared to what we used to be. In terms of vehicles, we can go look at that. But I think where your question takes us is not just what's happening to the economy in 2021. What does this mean going down the road?
That's right.
As we start to or continue to kind of behave in the way in which we are now. So that's why I think in the 2022 projection, we talk about a range of $1.1 to $1.8 billion of challenge, because, we don't believe that our revenues are going to spring back, to what they were, say, in 2018, because of behaviors changing. So you raise a really good point, because, I mean, this is not going to get fixed overnight. And hence the reason why we have these discussions with the federal and provincial governments about financial sustainability. And, how is it that, because none of us want to year after year to kind of go cap in hand to the government of Canada and the province of Ontario, having to have the kinds of discussions we are now. It does raise the question, at what point do we have a more stable system of revenues to address, the realities that are unfolding as a result of COVID?
Yeah, so and Chris, just really quickly, what are you doing to quantify that? To sort of figure out. I get it. I understand that there's an enormous part of any budget, and this budget and future budget is guesswork. Guesswork in terms of assumptions, a whole range of assumptions in a whole a number of areas. But there's a very, very significant thing that's happening. For example, the downtown core is a commercial, it has a massive commercial sector to it. And if if, for example, a portion of that population is going to, in the future, be working from home, that has an impact on commercial space, that has an impact on patronage, that has an impact on the retail sector, that has an impact on, I'm just thinking of, for example, the path from City Hall to Union Station. What happens to that? Sort of as we get through the COVID cycle, and as everybody is suggesting, everything then comes back. But and what's the impact of that going forward? And I guess my real question is are we establishing any protocols or processes to sort of begin to, in advance of that happening, begin to quantify that in some way?
Yeah, so through the chief, I think what I need to do for you in working with our economic development culture group is to give you a snapshot of what we're experiencing now, and to the extent that we can project forward, what does that mean in the broad example that you're giving here. So, I mean, everything from, we know what's happening in terms of retail losses, and we know in terms of entertainment. You may recall in the very beginning here, we were projecting, impacts to the fundamental sectors of our economy, what we thought would be happening in 2019. So I think we can give you some information as to what we really know right now, but maybe even more importantly, what we really don't know or we're really guessing will happen. So that we can do,
please, because
I think you're onto something, as your colleagues have been as well. That's really important for everyone to realize that, as great as Toronto is economically and culturally and so on, the recovery here is going to not be as quick as we would hope, and so that creates a set of challenges that we have to prepare for, and it will inform the discussions that we need to have with the government of Canada and the province of Ontario.
I'd appreciate any information you can send along in that regard. That would be very, very good. Thank you.
For sure.
Thank you, Councillor. Next we'll go to Councillor Ford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the committee for their indulgence on the second round here. So 2 questions I have for staff. One, this budget process is going to be different than the 2020 budget approval. In terms of our communications plan with Torontonians and how they can, have their voices heard in the budget consultation process, how are we going to go about that?
For you, Mr. Chair, Councillor, one of the slides in the slide deck spoke to the approaching your, contacting your councillor, but also to, given that we're in a virtual environment, there is an opportunity to sign up and ask for a time slot to do a public virtual deputation. And then there is a written opportunity to participate. So there are obviously restrictions, but we're hopeful that given that there's a few different methods, that people will feel that there's an opportunity to participate.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Thanks. No, and I'm aware of that, but how are we getting the message out to the public that they can, how are we advertising through those means?
There are links on the city's website. There's links to budget committee as well, where the materials will be posted. And so other than the website, I think that our comms folks have used the opportunity to extend to the media as well. So I'm not sure if I can elaborate any more than that.
Okay. No problem.
Happy if you're interested in the comms plan, I'm happy to get that and share it with you offline.
I just think it's an important part of it, but that's fine. That's fine, Heather. And then my last question is somewhat hypothetical, but there is a rumored federal election in the spring. Does that in any way, shape, or form present any challenges and or opportunities for us that you have forecasted in working with the federal government? Because if there is an election, there is kind of a blackout period, and how do we deal with that?
I'll let Chris.
Yeah, if I can, through the chair. So that certainly does create maybe an opportunity for us in terms of addressing some of the fundamental needs of not just Toronto. I can tell you we're working with the largest municipalities in the country, as well as starting to work more directly with the municipalities in the GTHA. I mean, if that does in fact get announced, and notwithstanding there is a blackout period, I mean, our policy challenges are not that hard to communicate. I think they've been hearing about them for some time, and what suggestions Toronto, working with our other colleagues, might suggest through AMO or FCM. I mean, I realize we're not a full member of AMO by any stretch, but it does create an opportunity that we can take advantage of, to be honest. In terms of the ask is the ask. I mean, this isn't the first that they're hearing about what it is our challenges are. And so there's an ongoing dialogue, and really importantly, as much as bureaucrats, we can talk to each other, but the leadership of this council through Mayor Tory speaks for itself in terms of the results that you've been seeing. And that office is very familiar with what our asks are and our needs. And the alternative, as I think we've identified here, I think everyone knows, you start cannibalizing your capital program, you're not just affecting those assets in the community that people rely on, you're affecting your economy directly. So, I mean, it's really in everyone's self-interest to not, affect the capital program to the extent that it could be affected if we don't get the support we're asking for up front. So, long answer, apologize for that. Hopefully it's helpful.
All good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor.
Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, if I could just provide some additional context to the councillor, just based on their question with regards to how to engage, how does the public know? Each of you will be receiving a budget toolkit to help, and there is a public notice that will be going out.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Perks, you're next.
Thank you. My first question is a follow-up to something Councillor Layton asked. So staff said that the 1.7 million for mental health call diversions is actually just to do the work to set the project up, but there's a different number for what it would actually cost to run. Does anyone have an estimate of what that amount would be?
Councillor Perks, it's Julie here.
Councillor,
we're still just finalizing. Oh.
Just, Councillor, do you have your video on? We can't see you. I'm just wondering if that's, I don't know if it's technical or not, but just you may want to put your video on. Here we go.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
No worries, it's good. Okay. Sorry, Julie.
Sorry, Councillor Perks, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
We are working on refining that number. It is going to cost substantially more, as you can imagine, than the investment we're making.
Could you give me a ballpark, Julie? Like, is it order of magnitude estimate?
So there's a cost of piloting, and I'll ask Denise if she has a range, and then we have to roll it out across the city. So the numbers are still very preliminary, and that's why we're using this year. We're using this year to do a lot more deeper dive, so that when we come forward for the 2022, we'll have a strong estimate.
I'll pursue it with Denise offline. So moving back to some of the capital program issues, if I'm reading the presentation right, the proposed capital spend for 2021 in this draft budget is just shy of $3 billion. That's right? Slide appendix page 9, bottom line.
Through the chair, that's on the tax supported budget, excluding the rate programs.
Excluding the rate programs, thank you. And the number for what we're short, if the federal and provincial governments don't come through, is 856 million. My math tells me that's just a hair short of 30% of our capital plan, right?
confirm?
Yeah, okay. So one of the things about capital projects is, we have a construction season, spring to pre-winter, and, tendering stuff out and signing the deal and all that takes a while. I heard Councillor McKelvey say we're going to continue down the road of developing RFPs, but there's a moment when you have to print the ticket and go to work. And that's usually very early in the year, March. So we're approving a budget in February. A third of the capital program is at risk. And if we don't know by March, we're going to start having to just drop projects off the table. So I think I need to hear from the city manager and the CFO that before I vote on this budget, I will know what 30% of the capital projects are at risk.
So if I can, and happy to speak on this. So through the chair, I think that's coming from this meeting. I think you've said it as loud and clear as you can. I mean, the categories are important. The specifics are just as important to you. And of course, I know you know that our preference would not be to start with capital from current. I mean, our preference would, if we have to go down this path of spending the plan B money, if you will, then we would start with the reserves, but notwithstanding, you need to know the details. And so let us go away and see how we can respond to that.
Much.
Thank you, Councillor. Going into committee members, Councillor McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is about, it's slide 34, and it's the tax-supported 10-year capital plan. And you have the categories on how the money is invested. And so specifically on environment, it's 3.2 billion. And my question is that within the single department, or are you also looking at, across departments? Because I think we have this issue where, environment is, there's a component of it in transportation. There's a component of it in emergency services when you think about the paramedic station. So it's all these different departments. So is this breakdown, by department or by category?
Through the chair. So when we do these groupings, we look at programs that we can categorize. So specifically to the environment, it does include environment and energy, but it also includes initiatives in parks, forestry and recreation, initiatives in our TRCA investments. So it has a grouping of other programs included.
Okay, good. And then the other question I have is about resilience. And I know that we were looking towards how we could start to embed that into the budget process, similar to equity. And, especially now that we're trying to talk about building back better and being more resilient, how are we incorporating resilience into this budget?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor, there's a few ways that we're actually categorizing resilience. There's the social aspect of ESGs. We are looking at, and the social aspect, obviously, we speak to from an equity-based lens when we're building that into the budget. From a climate change perspective, I would say that I'll ask environment to speak up. But what we are doing is we are bringing in different elements that align with the priorities. And as Chris mentioned, climate change is a priority, addressing climate change. And so there's the plans that Councillor Layton had asked about. There's the capital investments that you just referenced. But from a resiliency perspective, we are categorizing the S of ESGs. And I do feel that we have reflected that in taking an equity-based budgeting approach. But obviously, as Chris mentioned, it's a first step. It's a massive step, but we will continue to improve each year.
Okay, and then last year, I think we had a budget note request that was starting to categorize where we are at resilience. So, and there were, through that process, I think it was kind of indicated, this problem that it is in all these different departments, and how do we start to categorize that? So I just want to flag, if I put in a budget note request later for that. Is that something that, you know, you think you'll be able to kind of do, recognizing that this is something that's, you know, year over year going to get better?
Through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely, Councillor. I think staff were anticipating that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions from committee members? Councillor Nunziata.
Yes, thank you. I just have one question, the questions that Councillor Proulx asked, I had the same concern and questions on that. But just to Heather, 2020, of course, was very challenging with our revenues. Do we have a total amount, because we deferred the property tax, on the loss of revenue that we had in 2020 as far as collecting taxes?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Councillor, I'm actually pleased to share that from a property tax perspective, our collections were almost on par from our 2019 experience. So the lost revenues that I referenced due to COVID, in actual fact, do not include any lost revenue on the property tax base.
Oh, okay. Thank you. That was my only question.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no other questions from committee members, again, I just want to, I think we'll adjourn the meeting. Thanking again staff for all the work you have done to point. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we have. I need a motion to receive the presentation. Councillor Carroll will move that. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Anyway, I just want to thank Chris, Heather, and Steve, and all the staff for the work that they've done in bringing all this to us. And we'll be doing the program reviews starting next week, and try to get as much information out to your residents as possible on their opportunities to speak to us, the full committee, on those two particular days on the 25th and 26th. And again, thank you very much, everybody, for coming out, and we'll see everyone next week.